Hello, everybody. I'm going to give everyone about 30 seconds or so to join, and then we will get started. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's webinar, The Right to a Healthy Environment, Part 2, the United States Consideration of the Right to a Healthy Environment. This is the second part of a three-part series on the right to a healthy environment. If you're an ELI member, you can find the recording of Part 1 on ELI's website. And if you'd like to attend Part 3, it will take place next Wednesday at the same time as today, and you can find the registration link on ELI's website. My name is Madison Calhoun, and I'm the Senior Manager of Educational Programs here at ELI. We have a great program in store for you today. I want to take a moment to thank all of our fantastic panelists who spent a lot of time preparing wonderful content for you all today. I also want to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors for the program, Delaware Law's Global Environmental Rights Institute, Barry University Center for Earth Jurisprudence, the American Bar Association Section of Environment, Energy, and Resources, the ABA Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, and the ABA Center for Human Rights. We so appreciate their help with organizing and promoting this event. I have a couple logistical notes before we get started. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, please send me a direct message. Additionally, we are saving time at the end for audience questions. Please don't wait until the end to submit your questions, though. So apologize. You can submit them through GoTo's questions box, and we will get to them when we have time. So now I'll introduce and turn things over to our fantastic moderator, Nadia. Nadia Ahmed is an associate professor at Barry University School of Law. So Nadia, I will turn things over to you, and thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Madison. I also especially wanted to thank the ELI for hosting this webinar, as well as our co-sponsors. We're gathering today to learn more about this about the UN resolution for the right to a healthy environment, which is going to be coming for a vote, hopefully later this month, before the UN General Assembly. The right to a clean environment is very crucial for other rights, including free speech, labor, health, education, as well as international human rights. US states, including Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Montana, have already enshrined this right to a clean and healthy environment in their state constitutions. Many other states are also considering or currently in the process of recognizing this right, including West Virginia, Kentucky, Hawaii, Maine, and other states. And so this is an issue that has broad bipartisan support, as well as broad public backing. So even there are a number of regional agreements, as well as rights that are enshrined within state constitutions that already recognize this right to a healthy environment, which includes global recognition of this right and the provision of effective remedies are a matter of utmost urgency for frontline communities that are exposed to climate-based impacts, environmental defenders, and vulnerable groups that are exposed to toxic and hazardous substances. According to Sebastian Dueck, who is a senior attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law, over 150 countries of the UN member nations have already recognized the right to a healthy environment. So we're really pleased to have this panel for you here today to speak about why the US should also be supporting this UN resolution. And we have as our first speaker, John Knox, who is an internationally recognized expert on human rights and international environmental law. From 2012 to 2015, he served as the first UN independent expert, and from 2015 to 2018, he was the first special rapporteur on the issue of human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And in that role, he submitted a series of reports to the UN Human Rights Council on the application of human rights law to environmental issues, including climate change and the conservation of biological diversity. So we're really pleased to have him here with us today. John, please take it away.
Hi, Nadia. Thank you. Thanks for the organizers for inviting me to be here. You can hear me okay? I'm not I'm not muted or anything. Okay, great. So I think some other speakers are going to focus a little bit more on the US and the aspects of this that are most relevant to the United States. I'm going to provide a little bit of background for where this United Nations resolution comes from and where it currently stands. So at the most general level, the kind of starting point for understanding the relationship between human rights and the environment is to realize that it's a two-way street. It's interdependent. On the one hand, a healthy environment is necessary for the enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, as Nadia said, including fundamental rights such as the rights to life and health. On the other hand, exercising human rights, including rights to information, freedom of expression, participation in governance, and access to effective remedies are all vital to protecting the environment. So it can be a kind of virtuous circle in a way. You protect human rights in order to protect the environment, and a healthy environment helps to safeguard human rights. There are a couple of different ways this relationship can be expressed. One is the more straightforward way of simply recognizing a human right to a healthy environment. But at the international level, that's been something of a struggle. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1948 and remains the kind of basic foundational document in international human rights law, doesn't include a right to a healthy environment for the simple reason that it was adopted in 1948, a couple of decades before the modern environmental movement. As Nadia said, that hasn't stopped states from adopting the right to a healthy environment, but it means that they've done it in their national constitutions. Over 100 states have done that, and in regional human rights agreements, which adds up to a very large number as well in Africa, the Americas, and to some degree in Europe and Southeast Asia. So that means that the entire world has never really adopted a global human right to a healthy environment. Instead, what's happened is that in the absence of this overarching human rights bodies have greened other human rights. That is, they've applied human rights like life and health to environmental issues. And on that basis, they developed a pretty far-reaching and detailed jurisprudence explaining what states should be doing in order to comply with their human rights obligations. That's where I came in 2012. As Nadia said, I was appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council to try and clarify this relationship. And I issued a series of reports culminating in 2018 with essentially my summary of what these human rights obligations added up to, which I called Framework Principles on Human Rights and the Environment. And I presented that to the Human Rights Council in 2018. At the end of that year, at the end of my term, the Human Rights Council renewed the mandate, appointed another rapporteur named David Boyd, a professor from the University of British Columbia. David and I, in our first kind of transitional report to the UN General Assembly in 2018, said, the time has really come for the United Nations to get with the program and adopt a human right to a healthy environment. David has worked tirelessly over the last 4 years toward that end with a lot of other help. I mean, this has been a group project, obviously, to great success, I have to say. In October of last year, the Human Rights Council for the first time adopted a resolution formally recognizing that the right to a healthy environment is a human right. And as soon as 2 weeks from now, it looks like the General Assembly is going to do likewise. Other speakers will say more about the value of this. I just want to make a couple of general points about it. Obviously, this is not a legally binding decision by the General Assembly. A United Nations General Assembly resolution has no direct legal consequence as a matter of international law or domestic law, but it still is very valuable for a number of reasons, including that it elevates the importance of environmental protection by treating it as a human right at the same level of importance as other human rights. It also integrates human rights norms on the environment. It provides a kind of underlying or overarching, if you prefer, norm that unites all of these disparate strands of human rights norms that have developed as a result of the greening human rights process. And it catalyzes further action, or at least we hope that it will. It will provide a strong basis for further action at both the international level, the United Nations level, but also at the domestic level. We hope that it will push states that don't have the right yet to adopt it, and push states that have adopted to do a better job of implementing it. That's kind of where we are today. I'll just I'll close by being more precise about what you can expect next at the United Nations. Just yesterday, the core group of governments that is pushing for this right, which includes Costa Rica, Morocco, Maldives, Slovenia, and Switzerland, just yesterday they circulated a revised draft, and we expect that in the next few days they will formally table that draft, which will mean it will become public. They expect to have it come up for a vote on July 29th, which is 2 weeks from this Friday. So we're in the very final stages before we can expect to see the General Assembly adopt this. I think there's no doubt that it will be adopted by an overwhelming majority. The only question is, will there be any negative votes at all? And if not, how many abstentions there will be? But my personal view is that there will not be any negative votes and that the number of abstentions will be quite small. So it will be really a remarkable and historic event when this happens. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing what other people have to say about the consequences of this, the implications, especially for the United States.
Thank you, John. Next, I wanted to introduce our second speaker, Daniel McGraw, who is an expert in international law and policy, particularly as it relates to environmental protection. He has extensive experience in non-governmental organizations, government, intergovernmental organizations, business, and academia. He was the president and chief executive officer of CIEL from 2002 to 2010, during which time he also worked on substantive projects, including climate change, international finance institutions, toxic chemicals, oceans, democratizing international dispute resolution, trade and environment, and the law of foreign investment. He's going to continue to work on these substantive matters in a new capacity at CIEL. And so we want to thank him for being with us today. Dan?
Thank you very much. And can you hear me? Good. All right. Well, thank you very much, Nadia. Thank you, ELI and the co-sponsors for organizing this. This is a very important topic, and it's important that people think about it. As Nadia said, I've been tasked with thinking about how this matters to the U.S. And there are three levels here. I'll try to approach them from the macro to the micro level. The easiest and the shortest is the macro level. Especially after President Trump, the U.S. leadership internationally has been challenged and questioned, and this continues because of the difficult crises facing the world right now. To oppose the right to a healthy environment, which the U.S. did actively do in the Human Rights Council last October, needlessly would antagonize our allies and antagonize countries that are facing environmental difficulties, not just from climate, but from other things. Conversely, this is a golden opportunity for the U.S. to show leadership, to be on the right side of history. As John said, there's a gap in the heretofore existing panoply, if you will, or a list of human rights, because environment simply didn't have a right that was specifically to the environment. We know a lot more now. It's time to change that, and it's being changed both with the Human Rights Council resolution and hopefully in 2 weeks in the General Assembly. So from a point of view of global leadership, the U.S. should and happily now is supporting this right. The second level is simply in terms of the environmental crises that are facing humanity right now. This right can help deal with them. We know that there are issues of climate change, biodiversity loss, toxification of the planet, water shortages. The list could go on. The point is that we have to take these issues very seriously, and the simple answer is that anything that helps is a good idea. We think that the right to a healthy environment will help quite a bit for the reasons that John said at the general level. And I want to go to one of the points he made about catalyzing future action. This reminds me of 1996, we were able to get the world community to agree to eliminate lead from gasoline. 2 years later, we were able to get it onto UNEP's work program. And in 2021, the last country, Algeria, stopped selling leaded gas at the pumps. Now, it took a long time. It took a lot of work by many, many people. But the point is, if you get a global statement like this, and then one can start having work projects and programmatic activities to implement it. And this, of course, goes in terms of the United States as well. If we have a policy statement, then we can start to act on it. One thing that John didn't mention about the importance of the right to a healthy environment is that it's really essential to environmental justice. And as most of our audience probably knows, President Biden has prioritized environmental justice. But even beyond that, it's a very important issue. It requires that there not be a disproportionate impact on any community, especially a vulnerable community or minority community. It requires there be essentially equal access to environmental amenities like clean drinking water, sanitation, parks, places where spiritual activities can occur, and equal opportunity to participate. All those could be achieved, and you still have injustice if the environment was of such a quality that it was killing people or harming them. And that's what we have now. First of all, we do have disproportionate impacts. The rates of heart disease, of cancer, of asthma are much higher in minority communities, for example, and low-income communities because of their proximity to polluting sources. It's just an example. But we have real problems about that right now in the United States. And if we take the view of right to a healthy environment, even if it's a conceptual right at this stage, not necessarily a legal right, that can round out the kinds of programs that we have and what we're really aiming at. I should also add that that right is included in the Environmental Justice for All Act that's before Congress right now. It's specifically included. In that case, it would become US law. But even if that doesn't pass, it's helpful to have it. And I would note that the American Bar Association, among many other groups, have endorsed this right because they understand how it can be helpful within the United States. So I'll stop there. And Nadia, I look forward to questions and to what Ashfaq has to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Our next speaker is Ashfaq Khalfan, who is the Climate Justice Director at Oxfam America. Before he served as the Director of the Law and Policy Program at Amnesty International, having also previously been a researcher and advisor on human rights obligations beyond borders. He also served as a policy coordinator on legal enforcement of economic, social, and cultural rights at Amnesty International. In this capacity, he authored or co-authored Amnesty's publications on legal enforcement of rights and on human rights obligations of international financial institutions, on the Millennium Development Goals, and on the post-2015 framework on corporate accountability. Before Amnesty, he directed the Right to Water program at the Center on Housing Rights and Evictions, involving research, capacity building, and advocacy for policy reform in 10 countries, leading international initiatives that have strengthened international standards on the rights to water and sanitation. He also consulted for the Office of UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the German Technical Cooperation Agency on Human Rights and development on issues related to specific issues, as well as working for the Canadian Federal Department of Justice and the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Ashfaq?
Thanks very much, Nadia. So I would, I'm getting a bit of feedback. So what might happen if this right, or when this right is recognized? I thought I'd speak a bit about the right to water and sanitation, which the path to adoption of the right to a healthy environment is actually followed. So water and sanitation was similarly not explicitly mentioned in the international covenants on either in civil rights or economic and social rights. It had to be read in, and for a very long time you had this ridiculous situation where, because it wasn't explicitly mentioned, it just got less attention in a whole range of areas in terms of constitutional recognition, legal recognition, less attention by international agencies. But then the point was made, and it was that water and sanitation is so fundamental to, and that really should be the criteria for whether a human right is recognized as a right. Is it fundamental for human existence? Is it essential to people's dignity? You ask anybody, person on the street, they will say, yeah, of course. But for some reason, that among lawyers, among economists, technicians, common sense doesn't quite muster, doesn't cut it. So you kind of need to get more than that. And so that's why this project had to be started, to actually ensure that water and sanitation were recognized. And that there was a very long process. Discussions started, at the international level in 2002, and it was not until 2010 that the UN General Assembly recognized the right for the first time. And that was in a contested vote, in which the United States abstained at that point, saying that it was because it didn't have enough time to engage with the bringing up issues of process. But until then, it had been a block. That changed in 2011 with the United States, and most of the other states that had been blocking rights switched, and it came around to a consensus at the Human Rights Council, and then subsequently at the General Assembly. So I'd say when the United States shifted its position, that was quite significant, and a lot of other countries followed along. And that's quite important also in terms of what the US does now, not only in terms of recognizing, but also being supportive of it being recognized with the clearest and strongest possible formulation without unnecessary caveats. So if I can then talk about what then happened. So from the perspective of my, for example, I was an advocate at the time and trying to advocate towards UN agencies, towards governments. And you'd say, okay, let's water and sanitation are human rights, and you get into that whole discussion. And I remember being really frustrated having to argue with them, and to say that you have to treat these things in rights. And in the legal argument, it goes, you make something like this. You'd say, or I'd say, well, the UN Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights has adopted a general comment which has said that the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights which contains the right to adequate living, it has recognized that this implicitly includes water and sanitation. And then I had to nudge them to wake them up, and then start talking again about, about the need for it. So what was really interesting was that when the UN General Assembly, Human Rights Council recognized water and sanitation as right, that obstacle was gone. It was just not a discussion point. Yeah, sure. There's some, if you brought it to a court, there would then be a question of whether this right is recognized as national law. But in terms of the practitioners, the people designing water and sanitation policies, people setting international standards and indicators for water and sanitation, the people who actually design, the budget, the pricing, the things that actually tangibly, affects people's lives directly. It was no longer a discussion. The question was then about how. What does it mean in practice? How do we reflect this? And it was really interesting to see that, and to see people who are working in the water and sanitation field, very male, very people with engineering degrees, didn't know very much about social sciences, lacked what are called soft skills, and they had to learn it, right? They had this mandate that they had to engage with. With human rights. And so it was much easier to talk about discrimination. It was much easier to talk about participation. It was slightly easier to talk about accountability and the power shift that should then happen, that should move from decision makers to the people are most affected. I say slightly because there was still a resistance there. Let's not not kid ourselves. Recognizing a right opens some doors, but it doesn't. It's not a full panacea. It just makes the struggle a bit easier. So yeah, that was my experience then, and I'm hopeful that the same might happen with environment. And not only does it strengthen the environmental agenda, Dan made this point as well, not only about strengthening the environmental agenda, but improving the quality of the decision making, bringing in the issues, the environmental justice agenda a lot more. We saw that happening with water and sanitation, and so I really hope that the environmental justice movement in the US is pretty advanced, and so this is hopefully another tool that can be added. But in other countries where that sort of perspective isn't as developed, I think looking at it from the perspective of the right to a healthy environment could be pretty transformative. So I'm pretty optimistic about what this can mean. As long as, of course, we're not expecting that this is a sea change in terms of legal recognition, as John said. It's not in itself legally binding. It's a pointer. It might make it easier to make the case for legally binding changes in legislation and national law, and also in terms of the international level, in terms of the way that other treaty bodies, in terms of the sort of human rights expert mechanism, the way other courts may want to take it forward, looking at this along with a whole range of other things, because one could make the argument that the right to a healthy environment is already legally binding on the basis of the particular treaties where the right is implicitly reflected. One could even make the argument that in terms of domestic general principles of law recognized by nations. So, but I'll leave that aside. I mean, that's maybe a separate issue. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over to the others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashfaq, and to our other panelists. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them into the question and answer box in the chat. I wanted to just share briefly as well about how we have been working with the ABA and ELI and other partner organizations to arrive at this moment, because it really shows the strength and the benefits of multilateralism, as well as the benefits of organizing individually as well as collectively. So we have been working really as this information campaign / education campaign to educate people about what is involved with the UN right to a healthy environment. And it may seem very complex, but it really boils down to this idea of having a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is really a human right. We have been organizing within the ABA for environmental justice specifically, and at the time the US had not supported the resolution when it was brought forward at the Human Rights Council, but back in November of 2021, the ABA president Reginald Turner sent a letter to the Biden administration commending its efforts to advance environmental justice and asking for support for Resolution 4813. And this type of effort had also been happening with the New York City Bar Association as well as other organizations. And so it shows that that there is a value as well as power within collective action, as well as ways to seek out support on issues. And one of the things that we really ask for you all who are on the webinar call right now is to educate others as well about this human rights, because this is not the end that we pass this resolution, but it then begins another phase of organizational capacity for having this type of framework within the US system, whether it's at the national level or the subnational level. And we'll get more into these issues in next week's webinar. And the first thing to also note is that the UN recognition of a healthy environment has no legally binding effect on either domestic or international law. And that's because neither Human Rights Council resolutions or UNGA resolutions are legally binding. But what they also do is they send a signal that there are political statements that are put forward, and they also serve as a way of organizing and mobilizing attention and resources to issues, specifically the issue of environmental human rights defenders. And another thing to also show is that there's really broad support for this resolution, that there's been over 1,300 NGOs which have supported it, along with 50 businesses, 120,000 individuals, and even 140,000 children, young people, and allies from around the world. And so this is really a momentous occasion, but it's really just the starting point. With that, I'm going to turn it back to our panelists. First, I will go to John Knox, and I wanted him to speak more specifically about how this support from the U.S. will be crucial. I know you've already spoken somewhat about this, but if you can to get into a little bit more detail about that, John.
So Nadia, do you mean support from the U.S. at the General Assembly right now?
Yes.
Yeah. So as Dan said, the United States took a negative position at the Human Rights Council last October, but since the United States was not a member last October of the Human Rights Council, it didn't have as much weight as it otherwise would have. But the General Assembly, of course, all states that belong to the United Nations are members. And so the United States kind of had to make a decision. Was it actually going to vote for this or abstain or even vote against? Ashfaq referred to the right to water and sanitation, which was recognized by the General Assembly in 2010. At that time, the United States did abstain. Its position for a very long time, the United States position for a very long time, has been essentially a negative one about recognizing any new human rights. The right to water and sanitation, in some ways, was an easier case because the argument was simply that the rights to water and sanitation were part of the right to an adequate standard of living, which also includes the right to food, the right to housing, and the right to water and sanitation just kind of could be implicitly included in it, especially if you consider it the right to health is kind of giving an assist. But the right to a healthy environment, although some states have considered it kind of inherent in other rights, it's also had a very long history of having its own standalone significance. And so the United States just is not friendly to those kinds of rights, to put it mildly. I've kind of joked about this, but it's actually the truth. When I was at the State Department as a young lawyer 30 years ago, I had the file on human rights and the environment. And the joke is that it was a very short file because all it needed to say was it had one page, which only needed one sentence. The United States does not recognize the human right to a healthy environment. And until I would say a few weeks ago, I was still hearing essentially the same arguments from the United States that I was quite familiar with, having heard them so many times before. But that changed. So the fact that it has changed and the fact the United States has come around on this is not only really important for the United States for the reasons that Dan said, I think, but also it has a spillover effect for other states. There are a number of other states that, like the United States, don't include the right to a healthy environment in their national law and are historically somewhat wary of recognizing any new human rights. They include Japan, for example, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK. All of those states, I think, are more likely now to vote for the right because the United States is voting for it, and other states that I haven't mentioned. There are just a number of states that will feel uncomfortable opposing the right, even opposing it by abstaining on it, if they're not in line with the United States and the vast majority of European countries, but they are in line in their opposition with Russia and China and Iran. Together with India, those are the four major countries that are now opposing the right. So I think the consequences, I think it's the single biggest shift in terms of its effect on the ultimate number of countries that will be supporting the right. It's the single biggest shift you could kind of imagine, given the political makeup from last fall. And I think it will result, there were something like 44 states that abstained in 2010 on the resolution on the right to water. No states voted against. I mean, I don't want to jinx anything. I would be shocked if there are more than 20 states that abstain now. I would be really surprised. I think it could be well under that. But if the United States had not changed its position and was still working against it, then I would expect it to look more like the 2010 vote. So it's a very significant shift.
Thank you, John. The next question I wanted to ask Dan is, what were the processes for changing the U.S. position in terms like this effort that you were involved with, as well as other efforts in the past, to the extent that you feel comfortable sharing that? I think it's important to see that what has been decided may not always be what goes forward.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. I mean, each effort to change the U.S. State Department's view is different. And in 1996, the State Department wouldn't recognize the right to housing, and we had to go to President Clinton. And we were able to do that because we had a cabinet member who was championing it. We don't have that this time. So we had to take a much more diverse approach. And first of all, I'd say on the substance, we tried to address every argument that the State Department mentioned, whether we thought they were preposterous or whether they had some merit. And among other things, I hope this is okay, John, but John prepared a white paper that, an excellent white paper, as you would expect from John, that tried to address those issues, and I think did so very effectively. But so on the merits, on the substance, we just said, look, this doesn't make sense. On the politics, we tried to point out that that there was no support from countries other than Russia and a few other allies, but the other allies weren't that strong. UK was for a while, but it ultimately voted in favor in the Human Rights Council. So we just tried to explain through op-eds and through phone calls and through every opportunity we could at an international meeting to point this out. As you said, before the Human Rights Council vote, there was this tremendous outpouring of statements of support. I won't go through them all. I'll just mention a couple more. One was from 15 parts of the UN system, including the World Health Organization, the UN Development Program, that said, yeah, we support this and we need it. Also the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutes, they came out with a statement in favor, and there were other ones as well. The Parliament of World Religions, the Islamic Association of North America. Again, none of this was hysterical, but it was we just kept pointing out that, look, you're alone in terms of this group of people who otherwise support your policies and that sort of thing. And we also pointed out the long history of antipathy to human rights that the State Department has evidenced. John referred to it. I'll just add a couple more. I mean, in 1982, we were the only country in the world to vote against the World Charter for Nature. It's just an example, but one can go down the list. And the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that was another place where we initially abstained. Then the current Special Rapporteur on Toxic Substances, Marcos Oriana, and I were able to convince the policy people at state that their legal analysis that they've been given was faulty. So again, this goes back to what John did with his white paper as you approach the substance. So we had all these different things. And then two things happened at the Stockholm Plus 50 conference in June 2nd and 3rd in this past month. First of all, there was a meeting between John Kerry and the Secretary General, and through various people, we primed the Secretary General, who had already spoken out in favor of the right to a healthy environment, to raise this with Kerry and to say, to ask him, why are you opposing it? Especially your whole career has been dedicated to protecting the environment, and now all of a sudden you're you're opposing this. That presumably had some effect. And then the presidents, the co-presidents of Stockholm Plus 50, Sweden and Kenya, in their final remarks, recommended the recognition of the right to a healthy environment. So it was really an everything but the kitchen sink kind of approach. And again, we tried to do it very professionally, non-hysterically, on the substance when that called for. And I should say too, that before we started trying to work the US government this way, I talked to Peggy Shepard, who initially was going to be a panelist on this program. She's co-chair of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, WEJAC, because I didn't want to be arguing that the right to a healthy environment is part of environmental justice without talking to people very active in the environmental justice community in the United States. It's not for me to make that decision. She was wholly supportive. I can't say how supportive she was in terms of realizing that the right to a healthy environment is the unspoken assumption of environmental justice. And one last thing I would say in terms of the overall impact, it reminds me of when Wangari Maathai got it was announced that she was getting the Nobel Peace Prize. You know, she said to me, she said, this validates, this confirms everything we're working on. And I think if we go back to what John said at the beginning here, that this right, by consolidating, by providing a framework, does that very thing. And we need that in the world right now, not just ethically, but we're facing terrible environmental challenges, and we need that kind of support.
I'll just add, Nadia, I want to give you a shout out for your role in this, because I think it's, you know, as the moderator, you may be a little hesitant to call on yourself, but you really played an instrumental role in getting people in the U.S. government to move by cleverly using leverage both within the government but also outside the government, such as the ABA and members of Congress.
Absolutely.
So
yeah,
I think that's
absolutely
crucial.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you. Thank you, John and Dan. The next question I wanted to ask is to Ashfaq. What do you think the US's support for the resolution signals, and how will it make a difference in other types of negotiations?
Right. I mean, so you mean other environmental negotiations, other human rights? Yeah. I mean, it'll obviously generate a huge amount of goodwill for the United States, or at least avoid, you know, what's the opposite of goodwill? But I think Dan was talking, you know, a lot about that. You know, particularly in terms of the climate agenda, you know, the US has not been getting a lot of great press. Even the successes that are being achieved, you know, at the state level, or you know, through the infrastructure bill. I mean, there's not a lot of international visibility on that. And you know, I mean, everybody knows about the failures. Everybody knows about the Supreme Court decision on the West Virginia case. And, you know, I can say that sitting in Oxford and just seeing the reverberation across people outside the US. So you know, it's just so crucial now that the United States is able to you know, to carry out the advocacy that it needs to, particularly on climate, and without being, you know, beset by unnecessary distractions. But I mean, so in this case, you know, it looks like it's a done deal now in terms of the U.S. position. So that's, you know, that's helpful, and it does send out a you know, a good positive message. I'd say something more broadly, more generally. I mean, for the longest time, at the human rights, international human rights decision making, you see this a divide between, you know, global north and the global south. And I mean, ever since I've been in the human rights field, and even when I look at the history, the US and global north countries don't seem to be uncomfortable being in that position of seeing a split between global north and global south on key human rights issues, right, from right to development to economic and social rights, and then in the environmental or the sustainable development domain, there's a huge dispute now about financing for loss and damage. And for those who are not in the climate space, that's basically the harms caused to people as a result of climate, which cannot be prevented through adaptation. And right now, there's a big dispute in the climate space about setting up a financing facility, meaning a international financing mechanism through which developed countries, richer countries, would provide contributions that would be specifically dedicated towards loss and damage. The US has been, at the last COP, there was a hard no from the US and the EU. The US has sounded a little more open to at least discussing these. And as I said, as somebody who is not coming from a US perspective, I just don't see what the US gains from blocking the development of financing facility, even if it wouldn't be a significant amount of money. So what I'm trying to say is, hopefully, the US's willingness to play ball on the right to a healthy environment, which is in its own interest, is a sign of a greater willingness to be able to let go of long-held positions, such as that 30-year position on the right to a healthy environment. Power is shifting to the global south inexorably because of just the shift in economic power, which is a good thing. The fact that we're moving to a more multipolar world means that particular countries cannot block global progress as much. So to the extent that the US wants to play this leadership role, there has to be a lot more of an emphasis on soft power because of this shift, because the Americans don't want to rely on hard power anymore. They want to rely on soft power. Again, a good thing. So I feel like I've perhaps gone a bit beyond talking about this particular recognition, but I just hope that this is a good sign of how the US is going to engage and be a really positive force that meets its own interests as well as global interests.
Thank you so much. Next, we're going to shift gears and turn to the audience questions. So feel free, if you haven't already, to type your questions into the Q&A chat. The first question, and it's open to any of our panelists, is that since this right is so very much an environmental justice issue, what are the prospects of the environmental justice movement in the US to persuade the lawyers to step back from, adamant opposition to the resolution?
I'm not sure of the question to which lawyers to step back. The United States has stepped back from opposition, and different groups are working with other countries. The EJ movement in the United States is probably not going to be that involved with other countries because the EJ issues are society specific in a way. Although Peggy Shepard is well known, she got the Legion of Honor from France. So it's not that the leaders are not known, but in terms of within the United States, the U.S. has already switched. Now, whether the Department of Justice incorporates this into its environmental justice litigation approaches, or whether EPA does, I think we'll probably have to work with them to get that to happen. That's like any other change in policy or rights, that you need to work to implement these things. And my guess is they will be open to that if we can help them see practical ways to apply it. But John, you've also been in the US government.
Well, I think if the questioner may be thinking in terms of the overall structure of, let's say, U.S. environmental law over the last 50 years or so, which has very much not really been rights-based. I mean, certainly there are specific rights, including, rights to bring citizen suits and things like that, which are important. But on the whole, the environmental justice movement, I think, has correctly identified a real weakness in the U.S. approach to environmental regulation. And I think what many people in both the environmental justice community domestically and the human rights the environmental human rights community internationally very much agree on is that that's just inadequate. That unless you have a rights-based approach, unless you think about environmental protection in terms of building in protections against discrimination and discriminatory effects, unless you build in from in the foundations, the idea that people have a right to live in a healthy environment, not just an environment that we've decided is kind of healthy enough, given everything else we're trying to do, but a really healthy environment. That would really change the way we think about environmental protection and environmental regulation in this country. I think that's a much longer and more difficult road, but it's one that the environmental justice community is quite familiar with and has been traveling down. And I think the hope is that this kind of recognition at the international level can be helpful in making those kinds of arguments have more salience. And I think others probably in this call and certainly in the audience will know more about, for example, the recent adoption in New York of an amendment to their constitution to add a right to a healthy environment. But it's those kinds of changes that I think are actually quite hopeful, even when it seems like progress at the national level can be kind of slow or blocked.
Okay, thank you. The next question we have is what U.S. states, either in their state constitutions or in other legislation, currently recognize the right to a healthy environment? So what are the other states that already recognize this right?
I can go if you want. I mean, I think the ones that are usually considered kind of the leaders in this, I mean, Pennsylvania is often cited. Pennsylvania was opinions. I've read different things on this. Jimmy May is probably, if he's on this call, is the authority. But Pennsylvania, for a long time anyway, was considered the very first adopter of a right to a healthy environment of any place in the world. And the right has, in the last several years in Pennsylvania, taken on new significance because courts in Pennsylvania have actually been construing it. But other states include Hawaii, Montana. What am I overlooking? There's 5 or 6 that have actually adopted it and have it, become part of their law. New York, most recently, of course, as we said. I'm overlooking Illinois. Is that one? Who am I leaving
Missouri,
out?
I think Missouri.
Let me just look it up quickly while we're talking. I'll give you a.
While you're looking it up, I would say that more research needs to be done on this, I think, to identify what's actually happening, not just in US states, but also internationally, where countries are trying to apply this right, whether it's constitutional or statutory or treaty-based. To understand in a more granular fashion what's actually working, what lessons we can glean from these other cases and that sort of thing. So it's my plea to some law professor and her or his students somewhere to do that work.
So I left out Massachusetts and Rhode Island, so apologies to them. But Hawaii, Illinois, New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Montana. I think those are the main ones that I know about.
Thank you. The next question is, could you explain the substantive content of the right to a healthy environment in terms of what does it encapsulate?
John, I think you need to take that.
Well, as a matter of fact, I am happy to direct you to my 14 reports I've written for the United Nations, and my only disappointment is that they're not better known. But I think you can buy them at Barnes & Noble, Amazon. Just kidding, they're not available. No one reads UN reports, but I did try to summarize what international human rights bodies have said about the relationship of human rights and the environment, and specifically the obligations of states, the normative obligations of states with respect to protecting the environment in these framework principles on human rights and the environment that were presented to the Human Rights Council in 2018. I specifically said in that report, you could also, if you would go ahead and recognize a human right to a healthy environment, this would provide the content for that right, not an exclusive content. It could continue to develop, but it would provide in other words, this is not a right that no one has any idea what it means. There's a lot of work that's already been done on this. And one way of thinking about the right is as again, integrating the work that's already been done, integrating the ways in which human rights have been applied to the environment generally. That's not the end of the story. I mean, many countries, again, have adopted this right as part of their domestic law. And in those countries, in many of them, there's an extensive jurisprudence. This is one of the things that I think even scholars in this area just frankly get wrong. You often will read references to the right to a healthy environment in other states, immediately followed by a statement to the effect of, well, of course, it's just window dressing. These things are never really enforced. I don't know what to say about that, except that they often are enforced. And some states have literally, some countries have literally hundreds of cases interpreting them. It's not like they're interpreted that, it's not like they're implemented that successfully in all states by any means, but newsflash, neither is any other human right. So the fact is there's a lot of law out there. So to summarize it very briefly, I think you can essentially say that there's kind of three categories of obligations that states have under the human right to a healthy environment. One is procedural obligations. States have obligations to provide information about environmental problems, to facilitate public participation in environmental decision making, and to provide access to effective remedies for environmental harm. The second category are substantive obligations. Scope-wise, the right covers all the aspects of a healthy environment, including a stable climate, including freedom from exposure to toxic substances and so forth. But states do have some discretion in deciding essentially how to balance the need for a healthy environment against other pressing needs that a state might have. But that doesn't mean that they can simply write off the need for a healthy environment. They have to strike a balance that's reasonable, that doesn't restrict the rights of the people involved, and so forth. The third, and this is where it really overlaps the most, I think, with the environmental justice movement in the United States, is the emphasis on non-discrimination and the rights of those who are living in the most marginalized communities. My successor, David Boyd, the current special rapporteur, issued a really important report in March on sacrifice zones, what he called sacrifice zones, showing that all around the world, the most marginalized communities are those that are the most susceptible to environmental harm. And so having a human right to a healthy environment at its most fundamental means making sure that we aren't essentially sacrificing some communities in order to have an overall prettier environment. There's a lot more that can be said about that, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, could I add two things, Nadia? First is for this group in particular, who I imagine this audience is, one of the more interesting things that John found when he did his mapping exercise was that there's a procedural human rights obligation to conduct environmental impact assessment when the environmental harm might affect human rights. So that's a very interesting procedural obligation. The second, and David Boyd, I think, would also mention the right to sustainable food. And I could be wrong, John, but I think that's a gloss that he's emphasized more than you did in your work. But there's plenty of content here. It's very important. it's not easy content to achieve. Don't get either John or me or Ashfaq wrong on that. But we have an idea of what we're aiming for. This is not something that's a mystery.
Thank you. The next audience question we have is, do you see the rights of nature to gain any traction in the United Nations?
I could take a shot at that if you'd like. My own feeling is that another advantage of the human right to a healthy environment is that it could lead to a better relationship between humans and nature. I think either ethically or functionally, the current anthropocentric view is failing and needs to be changed. And of course, a human right to a healthy environment, the holder of that right is humans. But in order to achieve it, we have to have a healthy environment. So in a way, the object of it is the environment. And a lot of people, not just me, feel that we need to somehow readjust this relationship between humans and nature and our attitudes about it. And whether that comes in the form of rights of nature or it comes in some other form, we'll have to see. But the main point I want to make here is that I think the right to a healthy environment is not at all at odds with that sort of realignment.
Thank you. The next question we have is, can you speak about what may have led to changes in the U.S. Position? And there was also a related question that asked, do you think the U.S. shift in position was driven by fear of China and the EU leading climate diplomacy? And the third related question is, how do you think our children's trust litigation, the atmospheric trust litigation, affected the U.S. shift? Anyone want to take a stab at what may have led to the changes in the U.S. shift in terms of whether it may have been from China or EU leading, or atmospheric trust litigation, or other factors?
I mean, honestly, Nadia, I think you're in as good a position as anybody to answer that question. But I'll just say really briefly, I tend not to think that this was driven by kind of fear of losing leadership to China or something like that. I could be wrong, but I don't think that was it so much as being out of step with the vast majority of the countries on this and being with China and Russia on it. I think it's just kind of a hard, I think in both the UK and the US, I think this was considered first as, let's say, a purely legal issue. And I think the legal approaches on both of those countries is pretty conservative on what they see as economic, social, and cultural rights. And so the idea of it, the kind of default position is we just don't really recognize new ones. Once it became more of a political issue in both of those countries, which it pretty, I think, inexorably did after a while, because there's really not much of a legal question here. It's not a binding decision legally. So once it became a political question, I think in both countries, the politicians asked, why are we opposed to this exactly? Like, what's the point of our opposition? Because there certainly seemed to be a lot of political costs to it. And then it became harder and harder to justify, and I think the country switched positions as a result. So I'm not sure that anything else, I think I'm not in any way downplaying the role that not people like Nadia and Dan and others played in actually forcing it to become a political decision. But I think once it became a political decision, it was more about just why are we imposing this cost on ourselves when it seems like awfully low-hanging fruit to join the vast majority of other countries in the world and support something that, after all, is consistent with what we're saying. I mean, one of the points that, as you know, we made to the government was Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and John Kerry have all literally said that people have human rights to a healthy environment. All we're asking you to do is say that to the United Nations when it comes time to vote. Why would you not do that? And I think eventually that was persuasive.
If I could add to that, I mean, everything counts in a way. So did the Juliana case make a difference? Well, it increased consciousness of climate change a bit, right? Did it really affect this directly? Well, it's a little like saying, well, there's a storm tonight. Did climate change affect that? I mean, climate change is now part of our reality. It affects everything. And so each of these individual actions, I think, are important. And Ashfaq mentioned the West Virginia case. I mean, one of my goals is to get the Supreme Court and others to the point of saying, well, of course Congress would have delegated that. It's too important not to delegate. Instead, you know, they can't imagine it. Remember, this was the first time ever the Supreme Court had stepped in to stay an agency rule before the lower courts had a chance to review it. Not on discrimination grounds or something like that, but on the merits. They stepped in back in 2016. They just couldn't imagine that this is important enough to deal with. We have to educate all these people, and obviously everything counts in that. So,
if I can try and address this, yeah, with with water and sanitation, it's been said, and I don't know this for sure, that it was actually Hillary Clinton stepping in when she was Secretary of State, and she looked at it from a from a women's rights perspective, and overruled the people there. Again, we won't really know for sure. I mean, there are people there in government who who would have been instrumental, and they're, unfortunately for them, not going to ever take credit for it because they're too professional to do that. So all the people who are involved and helpful, thank you so much, even though we don't necessarily know your names and we may not know them. Maybe some of them might even be listening to this webinar. There's so many, strange, variables, like the UK. In terms of getting the UK to shift its position, one of the significant factors was they were hosting the climate COP that year, and it would look ridiculous for them to stand against this right. So those things play, and of course clever civil society people who take those things and milk them for all they're worth. So yeah, lots of credit to many different people out there. Oh, and can I just say something on the rights of nature? I think it's inevitable that at some stage they will be recognized at the international level. But of course, even though the right to a healthy environment is anthropocentric, it's more, it's sort of enlightened anthropocentric, and if you look at, the more one thinks about these issues, the protection of biodiversity, at first glance might seem to be something quite separate from what humans need, but like they're, and John did a report on that, on biodiversity and how it's a whole range of human rights are dependent on biodiversity, from the future scientific benefits we may get, or just protecting our food, our air, water, and how they rely on other species. So the sort of enlightened anthropocentric view comes into part of the way towards recognition of the rights of nature, and I have no doubt that there will be formal recognition at at some stage coming in the future.
Okay, thank you so much. I wanted to turn it back over to our panelists to give 1 minute brief concluding remarks. And before I do that, I also wanted to especially thank the Environmental Law Institute, along with Christine Perry, Carl Bruck, and Jimmy May for helping organize this, along with Madison Calhoun, as well as Chandler. And I think that it's really important to acknowledge their support. And so I next wanted to turn it back over to our panelists if they can give us about 1 minute brief concluding remarks. We'll start with you, Ashfaq.
Yeah, just really wanted to thank everyone who's all of the people involved in organizing this panel and all of those who are attending, and for the colleagues who are interested in who asked about the state level recognition. Madison had provided the link, but at the same time next week, the discussion subnational recognition of the right to healthy environment. I think it's been great. I'm looking forward to that. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Dan?
I'd make 3 points. First, this is really important, and for all the reasons we've talked about. And second, I would just want to thank everyone who worked on this, Nadia, John, everyone. I've been involved in a lot of different environmental and human rights campaigns, and I've never been in one that's like this one. In this one, nobody is fighting for the mic. Nobody wants to impress their funders with their role in the process. It's been an extraordinary collaborative process, which I think should be recognized, and I feel honored to have been part of it. The third thing is, it's not over. It's not over till July 29th. And then, as someone said, maybe it was Nadia, this is one of those ends, which is really just the beginning. I mean, at this point, we have to implement it. We have to implement it around the world. We have to implement it in the United States. And that will take huge amounts of effort, and it's well worth it.
Thank you, Dan. John?
Yeah, I don't have much to add, really. I mean, I want to echo what Ashfaq said about, I think there are probably a lot of people in the audience who have actually contributed to this over the years, and I want to thank them for everything that they've done. This has been a true group project, a decade-long group project. And I just also want to echo what Dan said. This is the beginning of the next chapter. So now, now that we will have this, right? I think it's, unless barring some huge catastrophe, it will happen. What will that look like? What will happen next? And in that light, one thing to keep an eye on is that David Boyd, the current special rapporteur, has already said he's going to essentially devote his last 2 years to developing a kind of project to try and clarify what implementing the right to a healthy environment would look like. So if you're interested in that, I really encourage you to follow his work and look for ways to contribute to it at the international level. And of course, there's lots and lots of other ways to contribute to this ongoing effort, which I'm sure a lot of you are already doing. And so again, I want to close by thanking you for that.
Thank you, John. I wanted to again thank everyone for being a part of this. I also, we apologize that Nakiba Brown and Peggy Shepard weren't able to join us today because they had another conflicts that came up as well as a technical issue, but we hope to bring them on future webinars. And with that, I wanted to turn it back over to Madison Calhoun of ELI. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadia. I just want to give a big thank you to all of our fantastic panelists. Thank you, Dan, John, Ashfaq, and thank you, Nadia, for your wonderful moderation. We so appreciate your time and energy on this event. And thank you to our audience for taking the time to join us today, as well as for your many questions. I apologize that we couldn't get to all of your questions, but please do come next week at this time on next Wednesday for our final part of the series. Hopefully we'll be able to get to more questions next time as well. This recording will be posted on ELI's website, so if you couldn't make it to all of it or you have a colleague who wants to view it, you can look back at the event page there. And just a big thank you once again, and have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.